The morning Tamsin received her assignment to the Elderwood Archive, she knew her career as a scholar had taken either a fortuitous turn or a disastrous plunge into obscurity. Standing before the weathered stone facade of what had once been the kingdom's most prestigious magical library, she couldn't decide which fate awaited her. The building loomed against the gray sky like a monument to forgotten knowledge, its Gothic spires piercing the clouds while ivy crept across crumbling walls that had witnessed centuries of magical research. Most scholars would have seen this posting as exile, a punishment for her unconventional methods and tendency to challenge established theories. But Tamsin felt something else entirely stirring in her chest as she approached the heavy oak doors. The assignment letter crumpled in her weathered leather satchel had been brief and impersonal, signed by the High Council of Magical Arts with little more than her name, the location, and a single line that had made her heart race. Guard and catalog the remaining text before final dissolution. Final dissolution. The words carried weight that pressed against her shoulders like a physical burden, because everyone in the magical community knew what they meant. The Elderwood Archive was dying, its collections scattered to private collectors and rival institutions, its magical wards failing after decades of neglect. She was being sent not to study or research, but to oversee the death of what had once been the most comprehensive magical library in the known world. Tamsin pushed open the doors with both hands, the hinges groaning in protest as they revealed the interior that took her breath away despite its obvious decay. The main hall stretched upward through multiple levels connected by spiral staircases that seemed to twist into infinity, each floor lined with towering bookshelves that reached toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations that still flickered with residual magic. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through stained glass windows depicting famous magical discoveries, and the air carried the intoxicating scent of old parchment, leather bindings, and something else she couldn't identify, something wild and alive that seemed to pulse just beneath the familiar library atmosphere. Her footsteps echoed across marble floors inlaid with protective runes, most of which had faded to barely visible etchings that sparked weakly when she passed over them. The silence felt oppressive yet expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do with this sacred space in its final days. Tamsin had always been more comfortable in libraries than in drawing rooms or council chambers, preferring the company of books to the political maneuvering that dominated academic circles. But even she felt dwarfed by the magnitude of knowledge surrounding her and the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. She made her way to what appeared to be the main circulation desk, a massive mahogany structure carved with protective symbols and fitted with drawers that likely contained the catalog system she would need to navigate the Pran collection. A leather-bound ledger lay open on its surface, the pages yellowed with age and covered in handwriting that belonged to dozens of different librarians across the centuries. The most recent entries dated back nearly 10 years, and Tamsin ran her finger across the final line written in fading ink. East Wing sealed due to structural concerns. Contents to be relocated when funding. Quote, permits. She suspected that funding had never materialized, leaving entire sections of the library locked away and forgotten. As she explored deeper into the building, Tamsin began to understand the scope of her task and the tragedy of what was being lost. The fiction collection alone contained first editions of epic fantasies that had shaped magical literature for generations, their protective enchantments still strong enough to make the texts glow softly when she approached. The historical section housed chronicles of magical wars, political treatises written by long-dead monarchs, and personal journals of court wizards whose discoveries had revolutionized entire schools of magic. Most precious of all was the research collection, filled with experimental notes, theoretical frameworks, and spell variations that represented centuries of magical innovation and could never be replicated if lost. But it was in the restricted section that Tamsin felt the true weight of her responsibility settle over her like a cloak. These texts contained dangerous knowledge spells that could level cities, curses that could destroy bloodlines, and magical theories so volatile they had been deemed too risky for general study. The protective wards around this section hummed with power far stronger than anything she had encountered elsewhere in the building, suggesting that whatever council had overseen the archive's decline had at least maintained security around its most perilous contents. As she approached the iron gates that separated these books from the rest of the collection, she felt something shift in the air around her. A presence that made the hair on her arms stand upright and sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the building's poor heating. Tamsin had always possessed an intuitive connection to magical energy that her professors had called remarkable and her peers had found unsettling, allowing her to sense enchantments and ward structures with unusual clarity. Now that sensitivity screamed warnings as she stood before the restricted section, not because of the dangerous books behind the gates, but because of something else entirely, something alive and watching from the shadows. Between the towering shelves, she turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit aisles that stretched away from her position, but saw nothing except books and furniture covered in dust sheets that created odd shapes in the half-light filtering down from the upper levels. The rational part of her mind insisted that she was simply reacting to the building's oppressive atmosphere and the magnitude of her task, that years of magical study had taught her to trust her instincts when they screamed danger. Something lived in his library besides herself, something that had learned to hide in plain sight among the forgotten knowledge and crumbling architecture. As she made her way back toward the main desk to begin her cataloging work, Tamsin couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evaluated by unseen eyes, judged by a presence that had been waiting in these halls far longer than any human should have been able to survive alone. Her first night in the archive's small residential quarters, a suite of rooms tucked behind the main circulation area that had once housed head librarians, passed restlessly as unfamiliar sounds echoed through the building around her. Old buildings settled and creaked as temperatures dropped, but these noises seemed purposeful, almost rhythmic, like footsteps moving through distant corridors or books being reshelved in the darkness. When she finally fell asleep near dawn, Tamsin dreamed of golden eyes watching her from between library shelves and a voice calling her name in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. She woke with that dream clinging to her consciousness like morning mist, vivid enough that she found herself checking the locks on her door and peering into the shadows as she made her way to the archive's small kitchen to prepare breakfast. The building felt different in daylight, less ominous but no less mysterious, and Tamsin threw herself into her work with the determination that had carried her through years of academic challenges. She would catalog every book, document every magical property, and ensure that whatever could be saved from this collection would find appropriate homes before the final dissolution order took effect. The cataloging work proved more complex than she had anticipated, requiring not just bibliographic details, but careful documentation of each text's magical properties, preservation requirements, and potential dangers. Many of the books were enchanted in ways that made them difficult to handle. Some grew heavy as stone when opened by unauthorized readers. Others whispered their contents in voices that could drive listeners mad if heard for too long, and a few seemed to rearrange their own text based on who was reading them. Tamsin had to develop new techniques for documenting these properties safely, often working with protective gloves and wards that left her magically drained by the end of each day. It was during her third night in the archive that she first saw him clearly, though at the time she wasn't certain what she had witnessed. She had been working late in the history section, documenting a series of military chronicles that required careful handling due to their tendency to project battle scenes into the air around them when opened, when movement in her peripheral vision made her look up from her notes. A figure stood at the end of the aisle, pale and still in the shadows cast by the flickering magical lights that illuminated the reading areas. For a moment they simply regarded each other across the distance, and Tamsin felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. He was definitely not human, though he bore enough resemblance to humanity that her first instinct wasn't to flee. His height exceeded that of any man she had ever met, and even in the dim light she could see that his proportions were subtly wrong. Shoulders too broad, limbs too long, fingers that seemed to end in points that might have been claws. But it was his eyes that held her frozen in place, golden orbs that caught and reflected the magical light like those of a nocturnal predator, filled with an intelligence that seemed ancient and weary beyond measure. When he moved, it was with fluid grace that reminded her of hunting cats, each step deliberate and silent as he retreated deeper into the shadows until she could no longer see him at all. Tamsin spent the remainder of that night locked in her quarters, alternating between rational attempts to explain what she had seen and wild theories about what kind of creature could have taken up residence in the archive. Her magical education had included comprehensive study of non-human intelligences, from the noble dragon councils to the mischievous fae courts, but nothing in her knowledge matched the figure she had encountered. He had shown no aggression despite having every advantage over her, seeming more curious than threatening. But that restraint did little to calm her racing thoughts as she considered the implications of sharing the building with unknown entity. Morning brought renewed determination to solve the mystery that had literally walked into her life, and Tamsin began her research with the methodical approach that had served her well throughout her academic career. If a creature had been living in the archive for any length of time, there would be records, references, or at least rumors documented somewhere in the vast collection. She started with the most recent entries in the librarian's logs, working backward through decades of daily observations and incident reports, looking for any mention of unexplained phenomena or security concerns that might relate to her mysterious encounter. The search proved more fruitful than she had dared hope, though the information she uncovered raised more questions than it answered. References to the Guardian appeared sporadically throughout the records going back nearly 50 years, always in context that suggested the librarians had been aware of a non-human presence, but had reached some kind of accommodation with it. One entry from 30 years ago mentioned consulting with the Guardian regarding the cursed texts in section M7, while another from 2 decades past noted Guardian prevented break-in attempt, no action, required from City Watch. Most intriguingly, several recent entries included observations about books being reshelved in correct order, despite the library being officially unstaffed, and protective wards being renewed by unknown means. Armed with this evidence that her mysterious encounter was neither unique nor threatening, Tamsin began leaving small offerings in places she suspected he frequented: fresh bread from her daily rations, wildflowers gathered from the archive's overgrown gardens, and books she thought might interest someone who had been isolated for decades. The offerings always disappeared, though she never witnessed their removal, and sometimes she found them replaced with items that seemed chosen specifically for her benefit. Rare herbs that enhanced magical perception, crystals that amplified ward-working abilities, and once a small leather journal filled with detailed maps of the archive's hidden passages and sealed sections. Their first actual communication came through written notes, a method that felt appropriately scholarly for their unusual situation. Tamsin had left a letter beside her usual offering, introducing herself formally and explaining her mission to catalog the collection before its dissolution. The next morning she found her letter gone, and a response written in elegant script on parchment that seemed far older than anything she had brought to the archive. Your presence brings light to these forgotten halls. I have protected this knowledge for longer than you might believe possible. Perhaps together we can save what matters most. The correspondence that developed over the following weeks revealed a mind of remarkable depth and cultivation. Someone who had spent decades studying the archive's contents with passionate dedication. He knew the location and properties of texts she hadn't yet discovered, could provide historical context for magical developments that weren't recorded in official histories, and offered insights into spell theory that challenged her own academic assumptions. More than that, his writing revealed loneliness that resonated with her own experience of academic isolation, the pain of someone who had been separated from meaningful connection for far too long. Tamsin found herself looking forward to their exchanges with an anticipation that went beyond scholarly curiosity, though she was careful not to examine those feelings too closely. She had always been more comfortable with books than people, finding human relationships complicated and draining in ways that intellectual pursuits never were. But something about their unusual correspondence felt natural and right. Perhaps it was the shared love of knowledge that connected them, or the fact that their communication was filtered through writing rather than the social complexities of face-to-face interaction. But she felt more understood by this mysterious guardian than she had by any of her academic colleagues. As their notes grew longer and more personal, Tamsin began sharing details about her own life and experiences her frustration with the political machinations that dominated magical academia, her fear that truly important research was being abandoned in favor of flashy but superficial studies, and her deep sadness at witnessing the archive's decline. In return, He shared observations about the changing nature of magical scholarship, insights into the personalities of previous librarians he had known, and gradually, carefully, hints about his own nature and circumstances that painted a picture of tragedy and undeserved isolation. The first mention of a curse came buried in a longer discussion about the ethical implications of magical punishment, phrased so casually that she almost missed its significance. There are fates worse than death, as I have learned through personal experience, though I have come to understand that curses often teach lessons their creators never intended. When she pressed for details in her next letter, his response was more direct. I was not always as you might imagine me now. The shape I wear is the result of choices made in anger and desperation, though whether the fault lies with the one who cast the curse or the one who earned it remains a matter of perspective I am still trying to resolve. Tamsin's magical education have included extensive study of curse structures and their theoretical solutions, knowledge that proved invaluable as their correspondence revealed more details about his situation. The curse that bound him was complex and layered, involving not just physical transformation but also magical bindings that prevented him from leaving the archive or communicating with the outside world through conventional means. Most cruelly, it included provisions that made his condition worsen over time, slowly eroding his ability to maintain human thought and speech as the years passed, ensuring that even if he found a way to break the curse, delay might rob him of the very humanity he sought to reclaim. The mechanism for breaking the curse, when he finally revealed it, struck her as both beautifully romantic and terrifyingly impractical. True love freely given and returned before the final page burns. The final page referred to a specific book in the restricted collection, a grimoire of such dangerous power that it was slowly consuming itself to prevent its knowledge from falling into the wrong hands, leaving behind only ash and fading magic. According to his calculations, perhaps 6 months remained before the book's complete destruction would make his curse permanent and irreversible. Tamsin stared at those words for a long time, her mind reeling with the implications of what he had shared with her. True love was not something that could be summoned on command or manufactured through good intentions, and the time limit created pressure that seemed likely to make genuine emotion even more difficult to achieve. Yet as she considered the alternative, watching him fade away into nothing more than a beast haunting empty halls, she felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest that had nothing to do with academic curiosity, scholarly obligation. Their next exchange is more cautious, both of them apparently aware that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship now that the possibility of deeper connection had been explicitly acknowledged. Tamsin found herself crafting her letters with unusual care, wanting to convey warmth and interest without seeming to force emotions that might not yet exist. His responses showed similar delicacy, offering friendship and companionship while making it clear that he expected nothing more from her than the kindness she had already shown. But physical proximity proved more powerful than careful letters, and Tamsin began spending her evenings in the main reading room rather than her quarters, ostensibly working on her cataloging but actually hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious guardian. She started speaking aloud as she worked, sharing her thoughts about the text she was examining or the challenges she was facing, addressing empty air, but somehow knowing that he was listening from whatever shadows concealed him. Sometimes she heard soft footsteps moving through nearby aisles, or caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, and gradually she began to sense his presence even when she couldn't see or hear him directly. The night he finally spoke to her, Tamsin was struggling with a particularly difficult text that seemed determined to hide its contents from her examination. The ancient spellbook kept rearranging its pages whenever she tried to catalog its contents, and her frustration had reached the point where she was muttering unflattering observations about the book's ancestry. Magical legitimacy. A low chuckle from somewhere behind her made her freeze, the sound rich and warm despite its obvious attempt to remain quiet. And when she turned, she saw him standing in the lamplight at the edge of her reading area. Up close, he was even more striking than her brief previous glimpses had suggested. Tall and lean with aristocratic features that spoke of noble breeding despite the bestial elements the curse had added to his appearance. His hair was dark and longer than current fashion dictated, falling across his forehead in a way that partially obscured eyes that held intelligence and sadness in equal measure. The changes wrought by his curse were more subtle than she had expected: slightly elongated limbs, fingers that ended in points that were definitely claws, and an otherworldly grace that made every movement seem deliberately controlled, but they were enough to mark him as something other than human to any observer. "Forgive me," he said, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place, and a formality that suggested noble upbringing. "But I have found your commentary on that particular grimoire more illuminating than most academic treatises on the subject. You have a gift for cutting through pretension to reach the heart of complex matters." He gestured toward the recalcitrant spellbook with one clawed hand, and Tamsin noticed that his mere presence seemed to calm the text's restless page-turning. "Perhaps I might offer some assistance with its more stubborn aspects." The conversation that followed stretched well into the night, covering everything from practical spell theory to philosophical questions about the nature of magical knowledge and its proper use. Tamsin found herself more intellectually stimulated than she had been in years, challenged by perspectives that were both learned and unconventional, forced to defend positions she had never thought to question, and introduced to ideas that opened new avenues of understanding. More than that, she discovered that he possessed a dry wit and gentle humor that complemented her own tendencies towards sarcasm and irreverence, creating a rapport that felt natural despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. When exhaustion finally forced her to retire for the night, Tamsin realized that she had just experienced the best evening of her adult life, and the recognition brought with it a flutter of something that might have been hope. The guardian he had introduced himself as Kieran, though she suspected that was not the name he had been born with, had shown no signs of the bestial nature his curse was supposedly fostering. His conversation had been that of a cultured gentleman with extensive education and natural empathy, someone who would have been welcomed in any scholarly circle if not for his physical transformation. Their evening conversations became a regular occurrence, though Kieran maintained careful distance and formal courtesy that spoke of ingrained noble manners and genuine respect for her comfort. He never presumed upon her attention or made demands on her time, appearing only when she seemed inclined for company and withdrawing gracefully when she needed to focus on her work. Gradually, however, the boundaries between them began to soften as intellectual connection grew into something deeper and more personal. Tamsin learned that he had been cursed nearly 40 years ago, the result of a confrontation with a powerful sorceress whose advances he had rejected. The curse had bound into the archive because it had been his family's ancestral seep, generations of nobles who had served as patrons and protectors of magical learning. His title and estates had been forfeit when he failed to appear at court to answer charges of abandoning his duties, leaving him legally dead while trapped in a form that grew less human with each passing year. The loneliness and isolation had been almost unbearable until her arrival brought the first meaningful companionship he had experienced since his transformation. In return, she shared her own experiences of isolation within the academic community. The way her unconventional methods and direct manner had earned her respect for her abilities but excluded her from the social networks that determined career advancement. She had always felt like an outsider looking in on a world she could navigate but never truly join, watching colleagues form alliances and friendships that were closed to someone who preferred books to parties and research to gossip. With Kieran, however, she felt understood and appreciated in ways that transcended physical appearance or social expectations. The attraction that grew between them was gradual and multifaceted, built on intellectual respect and emotional compatibility rather than simple physical desire. Tamsin found herself drawn to his quick mind and gentle nature, the way he listened to her ideas with genuine interest and offered insights that enhanced rather than challenged her thinking. Kieran seemed equally captivated by her passion for knowledge and her willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the person he remained despite his curse. Their conversations grew more intimate as weeks passed, revealing fears and dreams and vulnerabilities that neither had shared with anyone else in years. But the specter of the burning book hung over every interaction, its slow self-destruction a constant reminder that their time was limited and their situation desperate. Tamsin could see changes in Kieran as the curse progressed, subtle shifts in his speech patterns and reflexes that suggested the beast was gaining strength, while his human consciousness grew more fragile. The knowledge that she might be his only hope for salvation created pressure that made every moment together feel precious and fraught with significance she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. The first time he touched her was by accident, their hands brushing as they both reached for the same book during one of their evening research sessions. The contact lasted only a moment before he pulled away with obvious alarm. But it was long enough for Tamsin to feel the warmth of his skin and the slight roughness of calluses that spoke of hands that had once done physical work despite his noble birth. More than that, the brief touch had carried an almost electric charge that left her wanting more contact despite the rational voice in her head that warned against becoming too emotionally invested in someone whose future remained so uncertain. Kieran's reaction to the accidental contact suggested that he had felt something similar, though he was careful to maintain even greater physical distance in the days that followed. His formal courtesy became almost painful to witness, every interaction hedged with apologies and careful boundaries that spoke of someone who had learned not to hope for things that seemed impossible. Tamsin wanted to reassure him that his touch hadn't been unwelcome, but the complexity of their situation made such reassurances difficult to offer, without seeming to promise more than she might be able to deliver. The breakthrough came when she found him collapsed in the restricted section one evening, overcome by what appeared to be seizures that racked his transformed body with violent spasms. Without thinking, Tamsin rushed to his side and gathered him into her arms, holding him steady while the worst of the episode passed, and whispering reassurances that probably made no sense, but seemed to calm his distress. When the seizures finally stopped, she found herself cradling his head against her shoulder while he struggled to regain his composure, both of them breathing hard from the intensity of the experience. "The curse grows stronger," he managed to say when he could speak again, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "I fear I have less time than we calculated. The book burns faster now, as if it senses the approaching end and races toward its own destruction." He tried to pull away from her embrace, but Tamsin tightened her hold and felt him relax against her with a sigh that spoke of profound relief at finally being able to accept comfort from another person. They stayed that way for a long time, surrounded by the most dangerous magical texts in the kingdom, while she held him and tried to process the realization that she was falling in love with someone who might be lost to her, regardless of her feelings. The logical part of her mind insisted that what she felt was simply compassion for his situation, combined with intellectual attraction and the novelty of their unusual circumstances. But her heart recognized something deeper and more significant than rational affection. She was beginning to understand that Kieran had become essential to her happiness in ways that went far beyond scholarly companionship or romantic fantasy. When she finally helped him back to his feet, Tamsin made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Instead of maintaining the careful distance they had both been preserving, she took his clawed hand in both of hers and looked directly into his golden eyes as she spoke. "Whatever time we have left, I don't want to waste it being afraid of what we might feel for each other. The curse may win in the end, but I refuse to let it steal whatever happiness we can find together before that happens." His response was to lift their joined hands to his lips and press a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so perfectly courtly and romantic that it took her breath away despite the claws that could have torn her flesh if he had been Bara. "Careless. You are braver than I deserve," he said quietly, "and more precious than any treasure these archives have ever contained. If we are to love each other in defiance of fate itself, then let us do so with the full knowledge that even a few months of true connection is worth more than a lifetime of safe solitude." End quote. Their first real kiss happened 3 nights later, after an evening spent poring over ancient love poems that had somehow survived in the archives collection, despite their lack of practical magical application. The irony was not lost on either of them that they were learning about romance from texts written by people who had been dead for centuries. But the poetry provided a framework for discussing emotions that felt too large and complex for ordinary conversation. When Kieran read aloud a sonnet about finding unexpected love in the darkest circumstances, the parallels to their own situation were too obvious to ignore. Tamsin had been sitting beside him on the small sofa she had moved into the main reading area, close enough to follow the text but maintaining the careful distance they had both been preserving even after acknowledging their growing feelings. but something about his voice as he recited the final lines about love being the light that burns brightest when surrounded by darkness made her look up from the page to find him watching her with an expression of such tender longing that her resolve to take things slowly simply evaporated. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone and the subtle changes the curse had wrought in his features, and saw his eyes flutter closed at the contact as if her touch was something he had been desperately craving. When he opened them again, the gold seemed to glow with inner fire, and she felt herself leaning toward him without conscious decision, drawn by a pull that seemed to originate somewhere deeper than desire or affection. Their lips met gently at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as they discovered that physical chemistry was every bit as powerful as the intellectual and emotional connection they had been building for weeks. Kissing Kieran was unlike anything Tamsin had experienced with her few previous romantic partners, marked by a reverence and intensity that spoke of someone who had been denied intimate connection for far too long. He touched her as if she were made of precious crystal that might shatter at the slightest misstep, his clawed hands careful and gentle as they framed her face or tangled in her hair. But beneath that careful restraint she could sense the passion and need he was holding in check, the decades of loneliness and isolation that made every caress feel like a miracle he had never dared hope to experience again. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and staring at each other with wonder, Tamsin felt something shift inside her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. The emotion that flooded through her was so powerful and overwhelming that it took her a moment to recognize it as Lovnot, the gentle affection that had been growing between them for weeks, but the deep, transformative connection that changes everything it touches. She saw her own revelation reflected in Kieran's eyes, along with joy and terror and desperate hope that made her heart ache with the knowledge of how much they both had to lose. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural as they passed her lips. "I don't know when it happened or how it's possible given everything we're facing, but I love you more than I ever imagined I could love anyone." She saw tears gather in his golden eyes, and when one spilled over to track down his cheek, she caught it with her thumb and felt her own eyes blur with emotion. "And I love you," he replied, his voice rough with feeling. "With every part of myself that remains human and even with the parts that no longer are. You have given me hope when I had none, joy when I had forgotten what it felt like, and now love when I thought I was beyond its reach. Whatever happens with the curse, I will treasure every moment we have had together as the greatest gift of my existence." Their love, once acknowledged, became the driving force that shaped every aspect of their remaining time together. They spent their days working side by side to catalog the archive's treasures, and their evenings exploring the physical and emotional intimacy they had both been denying themselves for too long. Tamsin discovered that beneath his aristocratic manners and scholarly interests, Kieran possessed a playful side that delighted in surprising her with small romantic gestures, flowers arranged in her favorite reading spot, rare books left where she would find them, love notes written in languages she had to research, to translate. More than that, she learned that the curse had not diminished his capacity for tenderness and consideration, qualities that made their physical relationship as emotionally satisfying as it was passionate. He approached her body with the same reverence and careful attention he brought to handling the archive's most precious texts, learning what pleased her with an intensity that left her breathless and amazed. In return, she found ways to show him that his transformed appearance did nothing to diminish her desire for him. But the claws and elongated limbs and predator's eyes were simply part of the man she had fallen in love with, rather than flaws to be overlooked or endured. But even as they created their own private paradise within the crumbling walls of the archive, the curse continued its relentless progression, and the book that held Kieran's fate grew thinner with each passing day. Tamsin threw herself into researching alternative solutions with desperate determination, convinced there had to be some loophole or additional condition that might save him, even if their love proved insufficient to break the curse completely. She studied every text on curse breaking the archive contained, corresponded with distant colleagues who might have relevant expertise, and even attempted to contact the sorceress who had cast the original spell, though those efforts proved fruitless. The truth she gradually uncovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The curse had been designed with deliberate cruelty to ensure that even if love developed, it would likely come too late to matter. The time limit imposed by the burning book was calculated to create exactly the kind of pressure and desperation that made genuine love difficult to achieve, while the progressive nature of the transformation ensured that delay would render even successful love meaningless. Worse, the curse included provisions that would transfer to any children born of such a union, ensuring that even if they succeeded in breaking it, their happiness would be forever shadowed by the knowledge of what they might pass on to future generations. Tamsin shared her findings with Kieran during one of their evening research sessions, watching his face as he absorbed the implications of what she had discovered. She expected despair or anger, but instead saw only a calm acceptance that spoke of someone who had made peace with his fate long before she arrived to complicate it with hope and love. "I suspected as much," he said quietly, setting aside the text she had been showing him and taking her hands in his. "The sorceress who cursed me was nothing if not thorough in her vindictiveness, but knowing that our time is limited does not make it less precious. My love, if anything, it makes every moment we share more valuable than all the treasures in this archive." His acceptance only strengthened her determination to find a solution, and Tamsin began working with a focused intensity that alarmed even Kieran. She slept little and ate less, spending every waking moment studying curse structures and theoretical solutions, searching for some angle or approach that previous researchers might have missed. The work consumed her to the point where Kieran had to intervene, physically removing books from her hands and insisting that she rest before she collapsed from exhaustion. "You cannot save me by destroying yourself," he told her firmly one night when he found her asleep at her desk surrounded by towering stacks of magical texts. "And even if you could find a way to break the curse, what good would it do if the woman I love had sacrificed her health and happiness in the process?" He carried her to her bed despite her protests and sat beside her until she fell into proper sleep, his presence both comforting and heartbreaking as she realized how little time they might have left together. The final breakthrough came not from her intensive research, but from a chance observation that Kieran made during one of their evening conversations. They had been discussing the nature of the curse and its apparent immunity to conventional solutions when he mentioned something that had puzzled him for years. The gradual weakening of the archive's protective wards seemed to accelerate whenever he was particularly affected by the curse's progression, as if his suffering was somehow feeding the building's decay. The observation struck Tamsin as significant, though she couldn't immediately identify why, and she filed it away for further consideration. It was 3 days later, while cataloging a collection of theoretical treatises on sympathetic magic, that the connection finally became clear. The curse binding Kieran was not simply a personal affliction, but part of the larger magical working that tied his fate to the archive itself, using his suffering to fuel the building's deterioration and ensure that both guardian and knowledge would be destroyed together. The burning book was not just a timer but an active component in the spell structure, its self-destruction designed to create a cascade failure that would consume everything connected to the original curse. But sympathetic magic worked both ways, and if Kieran's suffering could accelerate the archive's destruction, then healing him might reverse the process. More than that, the very fact that he had survived 40 years of progressive transformation suggested that something was actively fighting the curse's effects, some source of strength or protection that had prevented complete dissolution of his human consciousness. As Tamsin studied the ward structures throughout the building, she began to suspect that the archive itself had been protecting him, drawing on its vast stores of accumulated magical energy to slow the curse's progress and maintain his sanity. The realization led to a desperate plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. If the archive was already connected to Kieran through the curse structure, then it should be possible to reverse the energy flow, using the building's stored power to break the spell rather than fuel it. The process would require precise timing and perfect execution, as well as a level of magical skill that pushed the boundaries of what Tamsin believed herself capable of achieving. Worst of all, it would require sacrificing most of the archive's remaining collection, using centuries of accumulated magical knowledge as fuel for the greatest curse breaking ever attempted. When she explained her plan to Kieran, his first reaction was absolute refusal to consider anything that would destroy the knowledge they had both dedicated their lives to preserving. I will not purchase my freedom with the destruction of irreplaceable wisdom, he said firmly, his golden eyes flashing with the first real anger she had seen from him. These texts represent centuries of magical advancement, discoveries that can never be replicated if lost. My personal suffering cannot justify such a sacrifice. But Tamsin had anticipated his objection and had spent days preparing her counter-argument, drawing on both practical necessity and emotional appeal to make her case. The archive is already dying, she reminded him, spreading the dissolution orders and structural reports across the table between them. The High Council has decreed that the building will be demolished within months, and most of the collection has already been dispersed to private collectors who care nothing for scholarly access. What we would be destroying was already condemned to destruction. But this way its end would serve a purpose beyond mere convenience for bureaucrats who see knowledge only as a commodity to be traded. More than that, she argued, his survival would preserve something even more valuable than the individual texts, the living memory of 4 decades spent studying every corner of the collection. The insights and connections that existed only in his transformed but brilliant mind. You are the archive's greatest treasure, she told him, her voice fierce with conviction. Your knowledge of these texts goes far beyond anything recorded in catalogs or finding aids. Lose you, and we lose not just the books, but the understanding that gives them meaning and context. The debate continued for hours, ranging across ethical philosophy and practical magic theory, as they explored every aspect of her proposal. Kieran's arguments were logical and compelling, rooted in genuine respect for the knowledge that surrounded them, and concern for the precedent that using books as magical fuel might establish. But gradually, Tamsin could see his resolve weakening, as the implications of the alternative became clear, not just his own transformation into a mindless beast, but the complete loss of everything they had both worked to preserve. The final factor that swayed him was not philosophical, but intensely personal. The realization that his transformation was accelerating beyond their most pessimistic projections. The seizures that marked his worst episodes were becoming more frequent and severe. And during their most recent occurrence, he had briefly lost the ability to speak coherently, reverting to wordless sounds that chilled them both with their implications. The book that served as their deadline now had fewer than 30 pages remaining, each one disappearing faster than the last, and they could no longer ignore the possibility that time would run out before they could attempt any solution at all. If we are to try this mad scheme, Kieran said finally, his voice heavy with resignation and desperate hope, then we must begin immediately. I can feel the beast growing stronger with each passing day, and I fear that soon there will be nothing left of the man you fell in love with to save. He looked around the reading room that had become their sanctuary, his expression encompassing grief for what they were about to lose and determination to make that loss meaningful. At least this way, our love will be remembered as something that created rather than merely consumed. The preparation for their attempt required careful planning and precise execution, as they would have only one opportunity to succeed before the magical backlash destroyed both the archive and themselves. Tamsin spent days studying the building's ward structure and mapping the energy flows that connected different sections of the collection, identifying the texts whose magical properties would be most useful for their purpose, and calculating how to sequence their destruction for maximum effect. Meanwhile, Kieran used his intimate knowledge of the archive to gather the most dangerous and powerful books from throughout the building, creating a carefully arranged circle of grimoires and spell texts in the main reading room where they would make their attempt. The night they chose for their desperate gambit was appropriately dramatic, with storm clouds gathering overhead and lightning illuminating the archive's Gothic windows as they made their final preparations. Tamsin had inscribed complex magical circles across the marble floor, connecting the arranged books with patterns of silver and gold that would channel and focus the released energy when the texts were consumed. At the center of the largest circle, she had placed the burning book that held Kieran's fate, its remaining pages now numbering fewer than a dozen as it continued its relentless self-destruction. Kieran stood within the innermost circle, his transformed appearance stark and beautiful in the flickering light of the magical preparations around him. The curse's progression had accelerated dramatically over the past few days, adding bestial features that made his non-human nature impossible to ignore. But his eyes remained filled with the intelligence and love that had drawn her to him from the beginning. When he spoke, his voice carried the formal cadence of someone preparing for a ceremony that might be either salvation or funeral rite. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, reaching out to take her hands despite the danger of disrupting the magical patterns around them. "I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my existence. You brought light to darkness I had accepted as permanent, hope to despair I thought was justified, and joy to a heart I believed had forgotten how to feel such things. If this is to be our ending, then at least it will be an ending we chose together, rather than one imposed upon us by the cruelty of others." Tamsin felt tears threatening to overwhelm her composure as she looked into his golden eyes and saw reflected there all the love and gratitude and desperate hope that filled her own heart. "This is not our ending," she said fiercely, her voice carrying absolute conviction despite the uncertainty that gnawed at her confidence. "This is our beginning, the moment when we refuse to accept what others have decreed as inevitable and claim the future we both deserve. I love you, Kieran of the Archive, and I will not let some bitter sorceress's spite steal you away from me without the fight of my life." Their final kiss before beginning the ritual was both farewell and promise, tender and desperate as they poured all their love and hope into a moment that might have to sustain them through whatever came next. When they broke apart, both were crying openly, but their tears were not just of fear and sorrow. They carried determination and fierce joy, and having found each other despite impossible circumstances and love powerful enough to attempt the impossible. The ritual itself began simply, with Tamsin speaking the opening words of the spell structure she had designed to channel the Archive's accumulated power into breaking Kieran's curse. The first books to burn were chosen for their relatively safe magical properties, creating a foundation of released energy that could be shaped and directed without immediate danger to the casters. As each volume burst into flames that burned far brighter and hotter than normal fire, the magical circles around them began to glow with increasing intensity, and the very air seemed to thicken with power that made every breath taste of ozone and possibilities. But as they progressed to more dangerous texts, the forces they were unleashing began to strain both the ward structure Tamsin had created and her ability to control them safely. Grimoires that had been sealed away for centuries because of their volatile nature released their bound energy in spectacular displays that shook the building's foundations and sent cascades of sparks showering down from the vaulted ceiling. The protective circles held, but Tamsin could feel them weakening under the assault of power that exceeded her most optimistic calculations for what the Archive's collection might contain. Kieran, standing motionless at the center of the maelstrom, began to show signs that the curse was responding to their efforts, though whether the response represented breaking or strengthening remained unclear. His bestial features seemed to fluctuate as the magical energy washed over him, sometimes appearing more human than she had seen him in weeks, other times taking on characteristics so alien that she had to remind herself that the person she loved still existed within that transformed shell. Most disturbing were the moments when he seemed to flicker between forms entirely, as if the curse was trying to decide whether to release him or consume him completely. The crisis came when they reached the most dangerous texts in their carefully planned sequence, books whose magical properties were so volatile that opening them incorrectly could level entire buildings or tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. As these tomes dissolved into flames that burned with colors that had no names, and released energy that made the previous efforts seem like candle flames by comparison, the ward structure holding their ritual space together began to crack and buckle under the assault. Tamsin felt her control slipping as powers beyond human comprehension coursed through channels designed for much smaller forces, and she realized with growing terror that they might have underestimated both the Archive's magical content and their own ability to harness it safely. But it was at this moment of crisis that the Archive itself seemed to wake up and take notice of what they were attempting within its walls. The building's original protective enchantments, dormant for decades as the structure fell into decay, suddenly roared back to life with power that dwarfed even the energies they had been manipulating. Ancient ward stones buried in the foundation began to pulse with light that could be seen through solid stone, and the constellation painted on the ceiling blazed with stellar fire that turned night into day throughout the reading room. The Archive's awakening changed everything about their ritual, transforming it from a desperate attempt to steal power into a partnership with forces far older and wiser than anything they had imagined. The building itself began to direct the flow of magical energy, channeling the released power of centuries of accumulated knowledge into patterns that resonated with both the curse structure and the deeper magical principles that governed such workings. What had been a chaotic storm of barely controlled forces became a symphony of power orchestrated by intelligence that understood curse breaking on levels that human magic theory had never approached. Tamsin felt the change as a sudden easing of the crushing pressure that had been threatening to tear her apart, the wild energies around them settling into flows that her own magical abilities could guide rather than struggle to contain. More than that, she sensed the archive's approval of what they were attempting, its ancient consciousness recognizing their love as something worthy of the sacrifice they were making, and adding its own accumulated wisdom to their efforts. The building that had been Kieran's prison was transforming itself into the instrument of his liberation, proving that even curses could be subverted when opposed by love backed by knowledge and determination. The climax came when they reached the final book in their sequence, a grimoire so dangerous that it had been chained shut with locks that required 3 different keys and protective wards that had kept it sealed for over 2 centuries. As this ultimate repository of forbidden knowledge burst into flames that seemed to burn through dimensions as well as physical space, the entire magical working reached critical mass and began to collapse inward toward the burning book that held Kieran's fate. The convergence of forces created a vortex of power that seemed to consume reality itself, pulling everything in the reading room toward a point of infinite possibility where all outcomes existed simultaneously. At the center of this magical maelstrom, Kieran underwent a transformation that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. His cursed form flickering through dozens of possible shapes as the spell structure holding him captive finally began to unravel. Tamsin saw flashes of the man he had been before his transformation, tall and elegant with aristocratic features unmarked by bestial characteristics, eyes that were brown rather than gold and filled with wonder at his approaching freedom. But she also saw deeper possibilities, versions of himself that incorporated elements of both human and beast, in ways that suggested the curse might be broken without entirely erasing its effects. The moment of resolution came when the burning book that had served as their deadline finally consumed its last page, the magical timer that had constrained their efforts dissolving into ash and released energy that triggered the final phase of their working. Instead of sealing Kieran's fate as the curse intended, the book's destruction became the key that unlocked the magical bindings holding him captive, its accumulated power joining the forces they had unleashed to shatter constraints that had held firm for 4 decades. The explosion of magical energy that marked the curse's breaking was visible from miles around the archive, a pillar of light that shot up from the building's highest tower and illuminated the night sky like artificial dawn. Within the reading room, the released power washed over both of them with transformative force that rewrote reality on fundamental levels, changing not just Kieran's cursed form but the very nature of their connection to each other and the magical forces that had brought them together. When the light finally faded and the magical energy settled into new equilibrium, Tamsin found herself lying on the marble floor surrounded by the ashes of centuries of accumulated knowledge, her body aching from magical exhaustion but her heart soaring with triumph and relief. Beside her, Kieran was stirring slowly back to consciousness, and she held her breath as she waited to see what form he would take now that the curse had been broken, and his fate was once again his own to determine. The man who opened his eyes and looked at her with wonder and disbelief was recognizably the person she had fallen in love with, though the transformation had left him changed in ways that reflected both his cursed years and the love that had saved him. His eyes retained flecks of gold that caught the light like stars, and his hands still bore the suggestion of claws, though they were now clearly human in shape and function. Most remarkably, he seemed to carry within himself an aura of magic that spoke of deep connection to forces beyond normal human experience, as if breaking the curse had awakened abilities that had been dormant prior, rather than destroyed. "Is it real?" he whispered, reaching up to touch her face with hands that trembled with emotion and exhaustion. "Am I free, or is this simply the most beautiful dream the curse has granted me before the final darkness falls?" His voice carried the educated accent she remembered, but with new harmonics that suggested the transformation had changed him on levels deeper than mere physical appearance. "It's real," she assured him, catching his hand and pressing it firmly against her cheek so he could feel the solid warmth of her skin and the tears of joy that tracked down her face. "The curse is broken, the archive lives again, and we have all the time in the world to discover what comes next." As if summoned by her words, light began to return to the building around them, the magical constellation overhead pulsing back to life, and the protective wards humming with renewed power that spoke of knowledge preserved rather than destroyed. Their reunion was interrupted by sounds from outside the archive, voices calling and footsteps approaching as people throughout the surrounding area came to investigate the magical phenomenon that had lit up the night sky. Tamsin realized that their desperate ritual had attracted attention that would soon bring official scrutiny to their sanctuary, along with questions about what had happened to the condemned building and its supposedly empty halls. The thought of having to explain their situation to bureaucrats and investigators filled her with dread, but Kieran's calm smile suggested that he had already considered this possibility and formed plans to address it. "My title and estates were declared forfeit when I failed to appear at court 40 years ago," he said, struggling to sit up with her assistance. "But the legal proceedings assumed my death rather than proved it conclusively. With the curse broken and my human form restored, I should be able to reclaim my hereditary position as the archive's patron and protector. More than that, the magical working we just completed has transformed this place into something far more significant than a mere repository of old books. It has become a nexus of knowledge and power that the magical community will be eager to study and preserve." Indeed, as morning light streamed through the stained glass windows and illuminated the reading room where they had fought for their future, it became clear that their ritual had accomplished far more than simply breaking Kieran's curse. The archive itself had been transformed, its crumbling walls restored to pristine condition, and its fading magical protections renewed with power that would endure for centuries to come. The books they had sacrificed in their desperate gambit had not been truly destroyed but rather transformed into a different kind of knowledge, their essence absorbed into the building's structure, where it would continue to serve scholars and researchers for generations to come. The investigation that followed their night of magic brought officials from the highest levels of the magical government, scholars eager to study the unprecedented curse-breaking they had achieved, and legal experts tasked with resolving the complex questions surrounding Kieran's restored status and the archive's unexpected preservation. Through it all, Tamsin and Kieran faced the scrutiny together, their love having proven itself capable of withstanding not just magical curses, but also bureaucratic skepticism and academic jealousy. The formal hearings that determined Kieran's legal status and the archive's future took place over several weeks, during which time they were allowed to remain in residence while various committees debated the implications of what they had accomplished. Tamsin found herself called upon to provide detailed testimony about the ritual they had performed, her academic credentials and careful documentation lending credibility to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as fantasy. Meanwhile, Kieran's restored memories and intimate knowledge of the archive's contents proved invaluable in establishing both his identity and his legitimate claim to hereditary authority over the institution. The final resolution exceeded their most optimistic hopes, with the High Council of Magical Arts formally recognizing both Kieran's restoration to his ancestral title and the archive's new status as a protected magical site of the highest importance. More than that, they were granted joint authority over the institution's future development, with Tamsin being appointed as chief scholar and Kieran resuming his role as hereditary guardian with expanded powers to protect and guide the archive's evolution. Their wedding took place in the main reading room where they had first kissed and later fought for their future together, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had come to celebrate not just their union but also the miracle they had achieved through love and determination. The ceremony itself was conducted according to ancient traditions that recognized the magical bonds they had forged during their curse-breaking ritual, acknowledging that their connection went deeper than mere human affection to encompass shared destiny and complementary purpose. As they exchanged vows beneath the constellation that had witnessed their greatest triumph, Tamsin felt the rightness of their path with certainty that banished all doubt about the choices they had made. The woman who had arrived at the archive expecting to oversee its dissolution had instead found love, purpose, and a future that promised discoveries and adventures beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. Beside her, Kieran stood transformed, not just in body but in spirit, no longer the isolated guardian of fading knowledge, but a partner in creating something new and magnificent from the foundation of what had been preserved. Their honeymoon was spent exploring hidden passages and secret chambers that the archive's restoration had revealed, discovering collections and resources that had been sealed away for centuries and now beckoned with the promise of new research and understanding. Together they began the work of documenting these treasures and planning how to make them accessible to scholars while maintaining appropriate security around the most dangerous materials. The archive that had once been dying became under their joint stewardship, a beacon of magical learning that attracted researchers from around the world. In the months that followed their marriage, Tamsin and Kieran established new programs and initiatives that transformed the archive from a mere repository into an active center of magical education and research. Students came to learn from their combined expertise, drawn by the unique perspective that came from someone who had spent decades studying the collection in isolation, and someone who brought fresh analytical approaches to ancient problems. The courses they developed together pushed the boundaries of magical theory while maintaining the rigorous scholarly standards that had always characterized the archive's work. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the creation of a new model for magical institutions, one that balanced preservation with innovation and individual scholarship with collaborative research. The archive became known not just for its magnificent collection but also for its progressive approach to making knowledge accessible and its commitment to training the next generation of magical scholars, practitioners. Under their leadership, it evolved from a place where knowledge was hoarded to one where it was shared, studied, and used to benefit the broader magical community. The children who eventually blessed their union inherited both their parents' love of learning and the unique magical abilities that seemed to result from their extraordinary origin story. Each child showed signs of the enhanced magical perception that had enabled their parents' success, along with intuitive understanding of ward structures and curse theory that suggested their bloodline had been permanently altered by the forces unleashed during that climactic night. Far from being cursed themselves, however, these children represented a new generation of magical practitioners whose abilities opened possibilities for advancing the field in ways their parents could only begin to imagine. Years passed in happiness and productivity, with Tamsin and Kieran growing old together while watching their archive flourish and their family prosper. The love that had begun as intellectual attraction and deepened through shared adversity matured into something that sustained them through all of life's challenges and changes, proving that the magical bond forged during their curse-breaking ritual had created a connection that would endure far beyond their mortal lives. They had not just saved each other from their respective forms of isolation, but had created something beautiful and lasting from the materials of their individual strengths and shared vision. In her final years, as Tamsin sat in the reading room where she had first encountered the mysterious guardian who had become her soulmate, she often reflected on the chain of circumstances that had brought them together and the courage they had found to fight for their future when all seemed lost. The archive around her buzzed with activity as students and researchers pursued their studies under the guidance of their children and grandchildren. The institution she and Kieran had saved continuing to evolve while maintaining the essential character that had made it worth preserving. The story of their love had become legend within the magical community, inspiring countless other scholars and practitioners who faced their own seemingly impossible challenges. But for Tamsin, the true miracle was not the dramatic curse-breaking or the institutional transformation they had achieved, but rather the simple fact that she had found someone who understood her completely and loved her unconditionally. Someone whose presence made every day an adventure worth living and every challenge an opportunity to grow stronger together. When Kieran joined her in those quiet evening hours, his hair now silver but his eyes still carrying those flecks of gold that reminded her of their extraordinary beginning, she felt the same flutter of recognition and joy that had marked their first meeting. They would sit together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the knowledge they had preserved and the love they had built, knowing that they had created something that would outlast their individual lives and continue to serve future generations of seekers after truth and understanding. The archive that had once been condemned to destruction had become instead a testament to the transformative power of love and the courage to fight for what matters most, even when victory seems impossible. Within its restored walls, the story of Tamsin and Kieran continued to unfold through the lives they had touched and the institution they had saved, proving that some bonds are strong enough to overcome any curse and some love is powerful enough to change the world itself. As the final pages of their shared story were written not in books but in the lives of those who came after them, the archive stood as eternal witness to the truth that had guided them from their first meeting to their final days together. That love, when backed by knowledge and seasoned with courage, possesses the power to transform not just individual lives but the very fabric of reality itself, creating possibilities where none existed before and ensuring that even the most beautiful stories need never truly end. But their legacy extended far beyond the walls of the restored archive, rippling outward through the magical community like stones cast into still water. Word of their unprecedented curse-breaking spread to distant kingdoms and remote magical societies, inspiring scholars and practitioners who had previously accepted that certain magical afflictions were beyond remedy. Letters arrived daily from desperate families seeking consultation about curses affecting their loved ones, from academic institutions requesting copies of Tamsin's theoretical frameworks, and from magical healers eager to understand how love could be quantified and channeled as a force for transformation. The requests for assistance became so numerous that Tamsin and Kieran established a formal consultation service, training a new generation of curse breakers in the principles they had discovered during their desperate crackle fight for freedom. These apprentices came from diverse backgrounds. Some were traditional magical scholars seeking to expand their theoretical knowledge. Others were individuals whose personal experiences with curses had motivated them to pursue healing arts. And a few were simply romantics who believed in the transformative power of love and wanted to help others find their own miraculous solutions. Among their most promising students was Elena Brightwater, a young woman whose twin brother had been cursed with lycanthropy after angering a forest witch during a poorly planned hunting expedition. Elena's fierce determination to save her brother reminded both Tamsin and Kieran of their own desperate circumstances, and they took special care in training her to understand the delicate balance between magical theory and emotional truth that made their methods effective. Under their guidance, Elena developed innovative approaches to curse analysis that incorporated psychological healing alongside traditional ward-breaking techniques. The success of Elena's treatment of her brother's lycanthropy curse attracted attention from the International Council of Magical Healers, leading to formal recognition of the archive's new curse-breaking program as a legitimate branch of magical medicine. This recognition brought additional resources and official sanction to their work, but also increased scrutiny from established magical authorities who viewed their methods with suspicion. Some traditional curse breakers argued that their emphasis on love and emotional connection was unscientific and potentially dangerous, warning that such approaches could lead to unstable magical workings if not properly controlled. These criticisms came to a head during the Great Magical Symposium held 5 years after their triumphant curse breaking, when Tamsin was invited to present her theoretical framework to an audience of the world's most, distinguished magical scholars. The presentation hall was packed with academics eager to hear first-hand accounts of the archive incident, but the questions that followed her lecture revealed deep skepticism about whether their success could be replicated by others less fortunate in their circumstances. Master Aldrich Stoneheart, representing the traditionalist faction of the curse-breaking community, posed the challenge that had been brewing since news of their success first spread. Scholar Tamsin, while your personal triumph is undeniably remarkable, how can you claim that love-based curse-breaking represents a reliable methodology when your own success depended upon such extraordinary circumstances? The archive's accumulated magical energy, your unique compatibility with the Guardian, and the specific nature of his curse created conditions that may be impossible to replicate in other cases. Tamsin's response drew upon years of additional research and successful case studies that had emerged from their consultation work, demonstrating that their methods were indeed adaptable to a wide range of cursed packer conditions. She presented statistical analysis showing improved success rates when emotional connection was incorporated into traditional curse-breaking protocols, documenting case studies where their techniques had succeeded where conventional approaches had failed, and theoretical models that explained why love-based magic produced more stable and lasting results than purely technical interventions. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. The archive itself had begun to exhibit new properties since their transformative ritual, becoming what magical theorists termed resonance amplifier that enhanced the effectiveness of any curse-breaking attempts performed within its walls. Couples facing magical afflictions made pilgrimages to the archive seeking the enhanced conditions that might give their own love the power to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and their success rate exceeded anything previously documented in magical literature. These developments attracted the attention of Queen Seraphina of the Northern Kingdoms, whose own court had been plagued by a hereditary curse affecting the royal bloodline for over 3 centuries. The curse manifested differently in each generation, sometimes as physical transformation, other times as magical affliction or mental deterioration, but always ensured that no heir could rule effectively for more than a few years before succumbing to its effects. Traditional curse breakers had attempted solutions dozens of times over the centuries, but the curse's complexity and ancient origins had defeated every approach. The Queen's visit to the archive marked the beginning of their most challenging case yet, requiring not just individual healing but understanding of how generational curses embedded themselves in bloodlines and magical lineages. The research process took months of careful investigation, with Tamsin and Kieran working alongside royal historians and court magicians to trace the curse's origins back through centuries of incomplete records, conflicting accounts. What they discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. The original curse had been cast not by a single powerful sorcerer, but by an entire circle of magic users working in concert, embedding it so deeply in the royal family's magical signature that it had become indistinguishable from their natural abilities. Breaking such a curse would require techniques far beyond anything they had previously attempted, methods that pushed the boundaries of what magical theory suggested was possible. The curse had evolved over time, adapting to each generation's attempts to circumvent it and growing stronger with each failed effort to break it completely. More troubling still, it appeared to feed on the very love and loyalty that bound the royal family together, using their emotional connections as pathways to spread its influence rather than sources of strength for resistance. The solution they eventually developed required the cooperation of the entire extended royal family, creating a network of love and mutual support that could overpower the curse's ability to divide and weaken them. Instead of focusing on a single romantic connection as they had in their own case, this approach harnessed familial love, friendship, loyalty between ruler and subjects, and even the abstract love of duty and service that motivated the kingdom's guardians and protectors. The ritual they designed took place during the summer solstice, when the archive's amplifying properties reached their peak effectiveness, and the royal family gathered in unprecedented unity. Dozens of participants contributed their emotional energy to the working, from Queen Seraphina and her immediate heirs to distant cousins who had never before acknowledged their royal connection. Court musicians played compositions designed to evoke feelings of belonging and shared purpose, while artists created works that captured the kingdom's history and the royal family's service to their people. The curse's resistance to their efforts was fierce and cunning, attempting to turn family members against each other by amplifying old grievances and dormant jealousies. Several times during the hours-long ritual, participants nearly abandoned their positions as the curse projected visions of betrayal and failure that seemed overwhelmingly real. But Tamsin and Kieran had prepared for such attacks, having learned from their own experience how curses use doubt and fear as weapons against those who challenged them. The breakthrough came when the youngest royal heir, a princess barely old enough to understand what was happening around her, spontaneously began singing a lullaby her grandmother had taught her. The simple melody cut through the curse's psychic attacks like a blade through silk, reminding everyone present of the innocent love that lay at the heart of all their more complex relationships. As other voices joined the child's psalm, the curse's power began to unravel, unable to corrupt or twist the pure emotion that flowed from such uncomplicated affection. The final collapse of the generational curse was marked by phenomena visible throughout the northern kingdoms, as aurora-like lights danced across the sky and flowers bloomed spontaneously in gardens that had been barren for decades. The royal family found themselves freed not just from the curse's direct effects, but also from the emotional barriers it had erected between them, experiencing deeper connections and understanding than any of them had but possible. Queen Seraphima's gratitude took the form of substantial endowments to the archive and formal recognition of Tamsin and Kieran as royal advisors on magical afflictions, positions that came with significant authority and resources to expand their curse-breaking research. More importantly, the success of such a complex case established their methods as legitimate alternatives to traditional approaches, earning respect from even their harshest critics and opening doors for further innovation in magical healing. The years that followed brought a steady stream of challenging cases, each requiring new adaptations of their core principles and pushing them to develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of how emotional bonds could be harnessed for magical purposes. They treated artists whose creativity had been cursed into destructive forms, soldiers afflicted with battle madness that fed on their protective instincts, and merchants whose prosperity curses turned every success into a source of isolation and paranoia. One particularly memorable case involved a master clockmaker whose obsession with temporal precision had attracted the attention of entities from the spaces between moments, resulting in a curse that trapped him in repeating loops of his own perfectionist tendencies. Breaking this temporal curse required not just emotional healing but sophisticated understanding of time magic and dimensional theory, leading to collaborative research with specialists from the Royal Academy of Temporal Studies and the Interdimensional Commerce Guild. The clockmaker's curse had been feeding on his desire for perfection, using his own high standards against him by creating situations where no achievement could ever satisfy his criteria for excellence. Each time he completed a project, the curse would reveal flaws invisible to others but glaringly obvious to his enhanced perception, driving him to restart the work in endless cycles that consume years of his life without producing anything he could consider finished. The solution required convincing him to embrace imperfection as a form of beauty rather than a failure to meet his standards, a philosophical shift that proved more challenging than any technical aspect of the curse-breaking process. Tamsin and Kieran worked with him for months, gradually demonstrating how his rigid perfectionism had isolated him from the human connections that gave meaning to his craft. They introduced him to other artisans who had learned to find joy in the creative process rather than just the final result, showing him that excellence could coexist with acceptance of limitation. The emotional breakthrough came when the clockmaker fell in love with a fellow artisan whose own work celebrated the beauty of irregularity and spontaneous creativity. Her pottery featured intentional asymmetries and unpredictable glazing effects that she incorporated into planned designs, creating pieces that were both skillfully crafted and charmingly imperfect. Through their relationship, he learned to see his own small deviations from absolute precision not as failures but as signatures that marked his work as uniquely human. The curse's dissolution was marked by the spontaneous chiming of every clock in his workshop, their synchronized sound creating a harmony that was mathematically imperfect but emotionally profound. For the first time in decades, the clockmaker heard his creations not as instruments measuring time's passage, but as expressions of his connection to the community that valued his skills and the lover who appreciated his humanity above his technical abilities. These successes established the archive as the premier destination for magical healing that conventional methods could not address, but they also attracted attention from less benevolent sources. Dark sorcerers began targeting the archive directly, viewing it as a threat to their ability to use curses as weapons of control and intimidation. The first attack came disguised as a research inquiry, with a visiting scholar attempting to steal documentation of their methods for purposes that became clear only when protective wards detected concealed curse casting implements among his research materials. Kieran's enhanced abilities, developed during his long years as the archive's guardian and strengthened by their curse-breaking ritual, proved crucial in detecting and repelling these threats. His connection to the building's protective systems had deepened rather than diminished after his transformation, giving him almost supernatural awareness of any hostile intent within the archive's boundaries. More than once, he intercepted infiltrators who had bypassed conventional security measures but could not hide their malevolent purposes from someone who had spent decades learning to sense the emotional resonance of everyone who entered his domain. The most serious threat came from a consortium of dark practitioners calling themselves the Entropy Circle, who viewed the archive's success in breaking curses as a direct challenge to their philosophical beliefs about the nature of magical power. They believed that suffering and despair were necessary components of true magical strength, arguing that healing and hope weakened the overall magical ecosystem by removing sources of raw emotional energy that could be harvested for greater purposes. Their assault on the archive was both magical and philosophical, combining direct attacks on the building's protective systems with attempts to corrupt the emotional bonds that gave Tamsin and Kieran's methods their power. They sent agents to spread rumors about the archive's work, claiming that love-based curse-breaking created dangerous dependencies and unstable magical conditions that would eventually cause more harm than they prevented. Other operatives attempted to sabotage successful cases by reintroducing curse elements after healing had been completed, hoping to create spectacular failures that would discredit the entire approach. The defense of the archive required not just magical skill but community support from everyone whose lives had been touched by their work. Former patients and their families formed protection circles around the building, offering their own emotional energy to strengthen the protective wards and detect infiltration attempts. Students and colleagues from other institutions contributed research and resources to counter the Entropy Circle's propaganda campaign, publishing papers that documented the long-term stability and positive effects of love-based healing methods. The final confrontation took place during the archive's 10th anniversary celebration, when the Entropy Circle launched a coordinated assault designed to corrupt the very foundations of what Tamsin and Kieran had built together. Dark sorcerers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the protective systems while undermining the emotional connections that powered the archive's enhanced capabilities. But the attackers had underestimated both the strength of the bonds they were trying to break and the number of people willing to defend what had become a symbol of hope for magical healing. The battle that followed involved not just Tamsin and Kieran, but hundreds of former patients, students, colleagues, and supporters who had gathered to celebrate the archive's achievements. Instead of the isolated targets the Entropy Circle had expected to face, they found themselves confronting a community united by shared values and mutual affection. The turning point came when the attackers attempted to use their most powerful weapon, a curse designed to feed on love itself, converting positive emotions into destructive force that would tear apart the very relationships that gave the archive its strength. But this curse encountered something it had never faced before, that had been tested, strengthened, and refined through years of successful healing work. The emotional bonds connecting the archive's community had been forged through shared struggle and mutual support, making them far more resilient than the simple romantic attraction the curse was designed to corrupt. Instead of destroying the relationships that powered the archive's defenses, the Entropy Circle's ultimate weapon became fuel for an even more powerful protective working. The love that had saved Kieran from his original curse had grown and multiplied through their years of service to others, creating a network of emotional connections that spanned continents and linked thousands of individuals in bonds of gratitude, friendship, and shared purpose. The backlash from their failed attack left most of the Entropy Circle's members stripped of their magical abilities, their own dark practices turned against them by forces they had never understood. Those who survived intact fled to distant lands where the archive's influence had not yet reached, carrying with them hard-learned respect for the power of positive emotion when properly channeled and focused. The victory celebration that followed lasted for days, but for Tamsin and Kieran, the most meaningful moment came in the quiet hours after the last guest had departed, when they stood together in the reading room where their own story had begun. The space around them hummed with contentment and satisfaction, the archive itself seeming to purr with pleasure at having successfully protected those who had given it new life and purpose. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had been assigned to a different archive?" Tamsin asked, settling into Kieran's arms with the comfortable familiarity of countless such moments over the years. "If some other scholar had come here instead, would you have found a different way to break your curse, or would you still be trapped in the shadows between the shelves?" Kieran considered the question seriously, his enhanced perception allowing him to sense the probability threads that connected past, present, and future in ways that ordinary humans could not perceive. "I think," he said finally, "that the universe has a way of bringing together the people who need each other most, even when the circumstances seem impossible. Perhaps especially then, another scholar might have found a different solution. Or perhaps the archive itself would have found another way to engineer the meetings and connections necessary for healing." End quote. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their youngest daughter, now a teenager whose inherited abilities had manifested as an unprecedented talent for sensing emotional resonance across vast distances. She burst into the reading room with excitement radiating from every gesture, carrying a letter that had arrived through the archive's special communication network for urgent cases. "There's a situation in the Eastern Principalities," she announced, waving the letter with barely contained enthusiasm. "An entire village has been cursed with shared dreams that are bleeding into reality. The local authorities are completely baffled, and they're requesting our immediate assistance before the dream-reality overlap becomes permanent." Tamsin and Kieran exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their shared excitement for new challenges and their pride. In their daughter's eagerness to join their work, the girl had grown up surrounded by impossible cases and miraculous solutions, developing an intuitive understanding of curse mechanics that complemented her parents' hard-won expertise with fresh perspectives that often revealed possibilities they might have missed. "Shared dream curses are notoriously difficult to break," Kieran mused, already beginning to consider the theoretical frameworks they would need to address such an unusual situation. "The curse creates feedback loops between multiple minds, and traditional isolation methods could cause severe psychological damage to the affected population. We'll need entirely new approaches that can work within the shared unconscious space, rather than trying to separate the dreamers." The planning session that followed stretched deep into the night, with all three of them contributing ideas and insights that gradually coalesced into a preliminary strategy for addressing the Eastern Principalities' crisis. Their daughter's suggestions proved particularly valuable, as her generation had grown up with different assumptions about the boundaries between individual and collective consciousness, allowing her to propose solutions that would never have occurred to scholars trained in more traditional frameworks. The case that awaited them in the Eastern Principalities would prove to be one of their most complex and rewarding challenges yet, requiring not just curse-breaking expertise but deep understanding of community psychology, dream theory, and the delicate balance between individual autonomy and collective experience. But as they prepared for another journey into uncharted territories of magical healing, Tamsin felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that had driven her throughout her career as a scholar and healer. The archive that had begun as her final assignment before retirement had instead become the foundation for adventures that exceeded anything she had previously imagined possible. Standing beside the man who had been her salvation and her greatest joy, surrounded by evidence of the lives they had touched and the knowledge they had preserved, she knew that their story was far from over. New chapters awaited them in distant lands and impossible circumstances, each one offering fresh opportunities to prove that love, courage, and determination could overcome even the most daunting magical obstacles. The constellation painted on the archive's ceiling seemed to pulse with approval as they made their final preparations for departure, its stellar light blessing their continued journey into the unknown territories of the heart and the mysterious realms where magic and emotion intertwined to create possibilities that transformed the world itself.